My good friends, I fear that this sermon is too long, too bookish, and not very sermonly. However, a leopard does not easily change his spots, and all I can do is crave your indulgence. I want to talk today about settler colonialism in Canada. Most of us are products of settler colonialism or live off its avails. Its principal avail has been the space it created for immigrants on land that not long ago belonged to Indigenous people. Settler colonialism, therefore, is about taking and creating, and also about loss. Both the taking and the loss say a great deal about the making of Canada, about what our country is now, and about its current opportunities. I come at these matters as an historical geographer, but also now as a Unitarian. First, a few words about settlers. The modern settlement of this country, the work for the most part of poor people ejected from Europe, was difficult. People were being pushed out of Europe by population pressures and declining economic opportunities. The changing relations between land and labor that drew many into the new factory towns drove others overseas. In the Western Highlands of Scotland, landlords displaced people from the clachan, the old agricultural villages, and relocated them in 3 or 4 acre crofts along the coast. There they got by harvesting kelp, used to make soap, until the market for kelp collapsed. Then a croft could not produce a livelihood, and the crofter's cheapest overseas destination was Cape Breton Island. In Ireland, many families survived with a hand loom, a cow, and an acre of land until the textile mills undermined hand weaving. What then? Starvation or emigration, perhaps to an English factory town, perhaps, if one survived an Atlantic passage in the hold of a timber ship, to a forested lot somewhere in Upper Canada. The land that these and other immigrants took on was harsh. It was not easy to overwinter in Newfoundland, perched between rock and sea. Not easy to quit a Paris poorhouse, find oneself virtually auctioned off to a strange man on landing in Quebec, and then dropped into a forested river lot with no equivalent experience, relevant experience, and rudimentary tools. Not easy to find oneself and one's children abandoned on a pioneer clearing in the middle of an upper Canadian forest because one's husband had cracked under the stress of it all and had fled. Not easy to quit a brick tenement in a British industrial city for a sod house on the bald prairie at 40 below. Settling Canada was a struggle. Many died or gave up, but overall the land yielded a little. As it did, settler Canada emerged, and immigrant lives changed. It was not possible to live in one place as one had in another, especially when the circumstances were so different. The mix of people was different. The relative value of land and labor was the opposite of what it had been in Europe. The whole texture of land and life was altered. In these new circumstances, cultures changed. So in early Canada, so today. My own roots are in England and Scotland. When I visit there, I am well aware of my people came from, and that I am no longer English or Scottish. If you think of your own story in this immigrant society, I suspect you know what I mean. Cultures have changed, and probably most of us would not want to exchange the settler culture in which we live for cultures and societies left behind. The point is that settler societies are not precise replications. For all the trials along the way, they are outcomes of creative processes. I have long studied and much appreciated the settler societies that took hold across this sprawling country. I am deeply committed to the country we have managed to create. That said, settler societies, the settler societies out of which Canada emerged, are on lands taken from Indigenous people. That taking was easier because introduced diseases killed so many, and because treaties regularized the process. Yet, taking is taking. Wherever newcomers settled, Indigenous people were left with tiny reserves, which, when settlers coveted them, often became even smaller. In 1840, a Mi'kmaq chief in Nova Scotia put it this way: "My people are poor, no hunting grounds, no beaver, no otter, no nothing. Indians poor, poor forever, no store, no chest, no clothes. All these woods once ours. Our fathers possessed them all. Now we cannot cut a tree to warm our wigwam in winter unless the white man please." Across the country and later, chiefs said much the same. Here's some comments from the McKinnon-McBride Commission touring British Columbia in 1915, 1916. A chief on the Nass said that his people felt as if, these poetic statements, someone had come along and taken away our clothing. Another said that his people felt as if we're living in a village with nothing around us at all. Within the settler colonial societies that came together at Confederation, Indigenous people were well under 1% of the population. They lived for the most part in wretched conditions on small reserves. From the vantage point of most settlers, they were invisible. These were not Métis societies, as John Ralston Saul has claimed. There could be no partnership when so much had been taken, so little respect accorded Indigenous people. Yet, settler Canada at Confederation occupied a tiny fraction of the huge territory that became British North America. A patch along the St. Lawrence River and west to Lake Huron, smaller patches in the Maritimes, but nowhere, as in the United States, a continuous, expansive relationship with the land. In America, the Appalachians were a surmountable barrier. The vast Mississippi Basin, when its indigenous inhabitants were killed or relocated, as most were, became one of the richest agricultural regions on earth. And the boundaries of settlement, set by aridity, were reached only far to the west. Across 2/3 of a continent, the land was welcoming. In Canada, by contrast, settlement was pinched between an intractable north and an international border. Until the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s reached the eastern shore of Lake Huron, then stopped. Attempts to settle the Canadian Shield failed. During the century after Confederation, immigrant settlement expanded across the Canadian prairie, through interior valleys in British Columbia, and even into a few edges of the Canadian Shield. But the basic pattern hardly changed. Within the patches of immigrant settlement, Indigenous people were still tucked away on inadequate reserves. Elsewhere, the population remained largely Indigenous. Settler colonialism, that is, newcomers taking up, settling, and dominating the land, had fit only small parts of this vast country, a basic geographical fact that underlies Canada. Although settlers did not penetrate most Canadian space, other vectors of the outside world did. Let me quickly enumerate their largely, and summarize their largely destructive effects. Disease. Indigenous people had little resistance to and no cultural experience with introduced infectious diseases, and they recycled through indigenous populations with devastating effect. Smallpox was particularly lethal. Samuel Hearne, in 1780, chief trader for the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Churchill on Hudson's Bay, reported that a recent smallpox epidemic had killed 90% of the Chipewyan nearby. One epidemic among many. Overall, across this country, 80 to 90% of Native people died in the first century after contact. Commercial capital. The fur trade required very few whites and relied on an indigenous people living approximately where they always had to trap and transport furs. Yet it shifted indigenous hunting toward the procurement of furs. It created dependencies on introduced goods. It integrated subsistence and commercial economies to produce a dispersed fur trade labor force sustained in good part by hunting, fishing, and gathering, yet producing a commercial product for an international market. By differentially introducing firearms, it increased the scale and intensity of indigenous warfare. Most tellingly, perhaps, it tended to undermine the ecological basis of indigenous livelihoods. Long before 1780, in many areas, beaver and marten, the furs most in demand, had become scarce. Also caribou, deer, and moose. Scarcity had often become chronic. Starvation often close at hand. Missionaries. Most missionaries believed that indigenous people were as precious as anyone else in the eyes of God, but that they lived in darkness. The missionary challenge was to bring them to the light of true religion. Superstition was to be replaced by correct Christian theology. Sinful ways would yield to civilized Christian lives. The missionaries brought, therefore, both a theology and a social agenda. They strove to eliminate indigenous spirituality and were constantly on the lookout for sin, particularly for sins of the flesh. Overall, the common missionary zeal to remake indigenous people anticipated residential schools. Industrial capital. Employment at mines and sawmills abruptly created wage laborers out of hunter-gatherers, located them in work camps segregated by race, and subjected them to a boss and a rigid time discipline. Usually unskilled for this new work, they entered at the bottom of an economy that commodified land and labor. People struggled in these new circumstances with high levels of substance abuse, sexual abuse, and cultural confusion, with violence, with mortality rates at or beyond third world levels. When it was time to hunt or fish, they often quit. Bosses considered them unreliable. Yet these new workplaces were themselves unreliable, subject to resource depletion, technological change, and fluctuating commodity prices. When they closed, indigenous people were left with a land, however depleted, and with new social pathologies. The state. As the Indian Act of 1876 made clear, Indians were wards of the state, in effect children whose lives were to be managed and civilized, an agenda that settler society took for granted. Either indigenous people would become civilized and assimilated into something like a modern Western culture, or they would probably die out. Behind this wide consensus was evidence of the declining number, until the 1920s, of indigenous people in Canada, the same Christian beliefs that propelled the missionaries, and a universalizing understanding, rooted in the enlightenment of the common worth and dignity of all people. In the 1890s, the Canadian state provided the principal financing for church-run residential schools. In 1920, it required all Indigenous children to attend such schools. It sent ships to pick up Inuit children on remote coasts in the Western Arctic and send them to schools far to the south, from where, years later, some would return whence they came, but now as outsiders speaking a different language. The residential schools were chronically underfunded, their teachers poorly paid and often unqualified, their students often traumatized, poorly fed, vulnerable to disease, bullied, and sexually abused. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission tells this story in agonizing detail. Apart from the residential schools, it was only after the Second World War that the state seriously expressed itself in most of these vast, thinly populated lands. With it came top-down management and scientific expertise. It sought to develop modern economies and weaken the constraints of tradition. In so doing, creating more individualistic societies open to democracy and capitalism. It encouraged capital to move into the North and encouraged and often forced Indigenous people to move to compact new settlements where services, medical attention, housing, and modern amenities could be more easily provided. It introduced producer cooperatives. Family allowance payments began in 1944. Old age pensions a little later. In isolated locations where industrial wage work came and went, the low biological yield of the land provided few and uncertain commercial alternatives, and commercial economies and traditional economies no longer supported growing populations. A new economy based on welfare was emerging. All these systematic introductions massively altered Indigenous life worlds. Indigenous people had been put through a wringer, yet the stubborn realities of a harsh land had not changed. North of the patches of immigrant settlement, the land attracted outsiders at only a few sites, and there usually to work for a time and leave. Apart from residential schools, it was only after the Second World War that the state seriously expressed itself in most of these vast, thinly populated lands. With it came planning, top-down management, and scientific expertise. It sought to develop modern economies and weaken the constraints of tradition. In so doing, creating more individualistic societies open to democracy and capitalism. It encouraged mining capital to move into the North, and encouraged, and often forced, Indigenous people to move to compact new settlements where services, medical attention, housing, and modern amenities could be more easily provided. It introduced producer co-ops. Family allowance payments began in 1944, old age pensions a little later. In isolated locations where industrial wage work came and went, the low biological yield of the land provided few and uncertain commercial alternatives, and traditional economies were no longer supporting growing populations. A new economy based on welfare was emerging. All these systemic introductions massively altered Indigenous life worlds. Indigenous people had been put through a wringer. Yet the stubborn realities of a harsh land had not changed. North of the patches of immigrant settlement, the land attracted outsiders at only a few sites, and there usually to work for a time and leave. Most who stayed had ancestors who had always lived there. Now, given the residential schools, most of them are no longer fluent speakers of their own languages. But the basic fact of the matter is that they are there, still the principal or only population in the largest part of Canada. It is these Indigenous people who, in spite of everything, have managed to survive on land that settlers could not use and are now speaking back to settler Canada in the arts, in creative and academic writing, in court challenges, in commissions on residential schools and on murdered Indigenous women, in protests against resource development, and perhaps most basically in their numbers. In 1961, the 220,000 Indigenous people in Canada were 1.2% of the population. In 2016, the 1,673,000 Indigenous people comprised 4.9% of the population. Over the previous 10 years, their population grew by 42.5%. Because most Indigenous livelihoods are no longer tied to the land, the ecological constraints that maintained low Indigenous populations no longer hold. The vast spaces that settlers could not settle will continue to speak out. Canada will become more Indigenous. Settler Canada has no choice but to pay close attention to what they have to say. Here are 4 recent examples. In a recent book, Marianne and Ron Ignace, he a chief and she a linguist, describe the traditional ways of the Secompenk, the Shuswap, and interior British Columbian people. They picture an intimately known and managed territory, stories that provided moral instruction and laws, decentered, consensus-based social structures, and a language that grew out of and sustained the particular Secompenk experience of land and life. All of this, in their view, is essential to what it is to be Secompenk, and their advice is clear. Hold on to stories, land and language. Even though many stories have been lost, the Secompenk control little more than 1% of their former lands, and there are fewer than 100 fluent speakers of the language. In a recent collection of her speeches over the last 10 years, Jody Wilson-Raybould, member of the Kwakwaka'wakwa Nation, Northern Vancouver Island, lawyer, and member of Parliament for this riding, argues for a rights-based reconciliation of Indigenous people and the Canadian state. Law, in her view, was the lifeblood of colonialism, and the Indian Act of 1876, the legal means of transferring power away from Indigenous people. Now, the rights of self-determination and of self-government have to be returned so that Indigenous people can manage their own societies and lands and express their cultures. In an influential book, Mohawk scholar-activist Taiyaki Alfred argues that a politics of reconciliation only serves to perpetuate the grip of colonialism. In his view, the overriding legacy of colonialism has been to disconnect Indigenous people from the land and to colonize Indigenous minds. Reconciliation salves settler consciences, but solves neither problem. Self-government can also be an empty shell because, in itself, it recovers neither land nor values. In Alfred's view, the challenge for Indigenous people is to reclaim and build upon the best from their own pasts. The land, seen as a locus of relations and obligations that constitute the ethical foundation of life. Everything is interconnected. Everything has spirit power. all my relations. This is the heart of what it is to be Indigenous, and a striking alternative to the possessive individualism, aggressive materialism, and wanton destruction associated with a massive assault on North America that accompanied settler colonialism and commercial and industrial capitalism. The geopolitical corollary of these views are Indigenous nations, as detached as possible from the larger fabric of Canadian life. In a book on Indigenous law in contemporary Canada, Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burrows suggests that rights-based approaches to Indigenous state relations are insufficient because lives are situated in complex webs of interdependencies which rights cannot identify. Indigenous people, he holds, now inhabit a multifaceted, pluralistic world. They are at once traditional, modern, and postmodern. Their identities variously constructed and reconstructed locally, nationally, and internationally. In these circumstances, the solution, in Barrow's view, is not to turn inland and create defensive cells of Indigenous nationhood, rather to inject Indigenous ways into the Canadian mainstream. He envisages more Indigenous people in command positions throughout Canadian society. He would refashion the law, particularly land law, to become increasingly Indigenous. In so doing, reflecting Indigenous understandings of interdependence. He would extend citizenship to land. In response, the whole country would become more Indigenous, and the many boundaries between settler and Indigenous Canada would tend to slip away. What then to do in response to the long legacy of colonialism in this country and to the variety of current Indigenous thought? I am struck by the vast store of local knowledge that underlies the Indigenous relationship with the land. Far deeper, far more profound than anywhere else in Canadian life, past or present. I am struck by the virtually ubiquitous Indigenous emphasis on land as a locus of relationships that bind people and land together and provide moral guidance. All my relations. This, as far as I can judge, is the most basic claim that Indigenous people make about themselves and their way of life. That it is grounded in relationships with the land so intimate that neither people nor land, neither the animate nor the inanimate, are separate categories. And I am struck that these views and contemporary Unitarianism are closer than one might think. If the theological ground has shifted to the point that nature is our creator, if we are now enjoined to love nature and our neighbor, and if, as our seventh principle asserts, everything is interdependent, then we, as Unitarians and Indigenous people, are not on drastically different tracks. If you don't have a copy of this book, I urge you to get it. And if you do have it, or if you get it, you should read Stephen Epperson's sermon on religious naturalism. It's in the end of the section on theology. It's an exceedingly important piece of writing, and it is on exactly this track. Heartily, heartily recommended. We're not on drastically different tracks. Nor is contemporary science, which also emphasizes interrelationships and interdependencies and acknowledges whatever else is in the vastness of the cosmos, the complex and unique web of intertwined life on this planet. Moreover, the existential risks posed by the climate crisis draw the public mind toward nature, question our current fit with it, and encourage a search for alternatives. All of this, I think, draws settler and Indigenous Canada toward each other. Finally, we live within pluralistic legal and constitutional systems. The Canadian Constitution is based, as it could only be given the diverse, scattered peoples of this land, in compromise, pluralism, and the protection of the ways of others. Over the years, others have been increasingly broadly identified. This is a promising base on which to work out a changed relationship with Indigenous people and with the land. However awkwardly and fitfully, as a country, we are engaged in this process. The outcome is crucial to the Canadian future, and perhaps as a measure of what can be done to the world. This Unitarian congregation is caught up in this broad undertaking. I am hopeful. So be it. All my relations.